very much, Dr. Bauer. I'm really happy to be moderating the last panel of the day. I'm also standing in here for Dr. Lipschitz because all these papers are from her class on the Russian Empire and Soviet regimes. So we're going to start off our panel with Kevin Smith, who's presenting on church and state relations in the Soviet Union during the 1920s. Kevin.
Marxism is an explicitly atheistic ideology. Karl Marx famously said, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." After the Bolsheviks came to power in the October Revolution, many Marxists expected religion just to fade away now that the people were no longer being oppressed by capitalists. However, this did not happen. Many Russians remained devoutly religious, and the Russian East Orthodox Church, the largest religious organization in the Soviet Union, managed to survive. The Russian East Orthodox Church was primarily treated by the Soviet government as a semi-political organization representing a relic of the old culture, too powerful to be destroyed immediately, but still worth actively opposing. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, Lenin enforced a kind of secularization of the Russian state and society, rather than outright atheism. As can be seen in Lenin's article, The Attitude of the Workers' Party to Religion, one of the main reasons was that he feared declaring war on religion would create an increased interest in religion. Even the leader of the League of the Militant, Godless, an organization sponsored by the Communist Party for the purpose of distributing anti-religious propaganda, did not officially advocate active administrative measures against religious organizations. He said such methods were both inefficient and ineffective because of just how many religious people there were in Russia. Instead, Lenin said they should change the social structure and work patiently at the task of organizing and educating the proletariat, which would lead to the dying out of religion. Upon seizing power, the Bolsheviks quickly took steps towards creating a more secular Russian society. According to William Husband in his book, Godless Communists, Atheism and Society in Soviet Russia, in the early revolutionary period, Soviet power centralized more on legal separation of church and state, undermining religious hierarchies and institutions, and destroying the economic base of the church, rather than trying to destroy the church outright. Following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks nationalized all church-held land, making it difficult for the church to financially support itself. All educational institutions, everything from parish schools to seminaries, were taken out of the control of the church and put under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Education. After that, religion was no longer allowed to be taught to children in public schools. In December of 1917, priests were stripped of their power to make legally binding marriages, and judges were given the power to issue divorces, a power previously held by the church. In a decree on the separation of church from state and school from church, issued in January of 1918, the state ordered religious symbols to be removed from public buildings and religious ceremonies and oaths to no longer be performed by state institutions. Thousands of clergy were either shot or arrested for resisting these orders. Some speculate that the state orchestrated violence against the church during this early stage, but it is a hotly contested issue. All these decrees were issued under an official policy of freedom of religion. For a long time, Lenin advocated for religion to be a private matter in relation to the state, even if the party was explicitly for atheism. The decree on the separation of church from state and school from church took away the church's special position amongst religious institutions and made all religious institutions legally equal. The Russian Constitution of 1918 guaranteed the right to distribute both religious and anti-religious propaganda. The right to distribute religious propaganda was later taken away by the Russian Constitution of 1929, but even it allowed for freedom of religious confession. However, priests themselves were removed from political life by not being allowed to vote or run for office. By doing this, all under the guise of religious freedom, the Bolsheviks were able to transition out of the old religious culture of the Tsarist regime and weaken the church at the same time. The church did not take this loss of political power without a fight. A lot of the resistance to the anti-religious decrees increased after the Patriarch of the Russian East Orthodox Church, Tikhon of Moscow, issued an anathema against the Bolshevik regime in January of 1918. During the months following the October Revolution, Tikhon was an adamant opponent of the Bolshevik government. He denounced the removal of church from public life and the destruction and desecration of churches that took place following the revolution. Even though the destruction of the church was not officially ordered by the Soviet government, It was in the anti-religious spirit of the Communist Party and was often done by party members. Kant went as far as to call attacks on the church satanic and condemned communist politics generally. Groups of believers such as the Union for the Defense of the Alexander Monastery actively tried to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking church lands. Even though the Union managed to gather almost 1,000 supporters, the resistance was put down, and the 5 main leaders were swiftly executed. Other small movements like this swiftly followed. It is important to point out that the church opposed the Bolsheviks on a political and military level prior to the October Revolution and during the Civil War as well. Between 1905 and the October Revolution, most clergy were not politically radical. They supported neither the creation of a kind of theocracy or a purely secularized socialist state like the Bolsheviks wanted. Instead, most of them were sympathetic to the moderate views of the liberal cadets. Following the October Revolution and during the Civil War, the church actively supported the White Army in their attempts to overthrow the Bolsheviks. For example, in Siberia, clergy helped organize Jesus Brigades and Holy Virgin regiments to help the white forces. Assisting the Bolsheviks' enemies like this gave some legitimacy to the state's accusation that the church was being anti-Soviet. However, the Bolsheviks' government's persecution of the church in the first few years of the after the October Revolution were rather mild compared to what happened in the coming decade. From 1921 to 1923, Russia went through a severe famine. In addition to things like asking for international aid, the Bolshevik government stole church property to provide famine relief for its people. Even though the church was willing to sell some of its property for famine relief, it was hesitant to give up its sacred objects. Some of these objects were very valuable, either because of their gold or as art. In February of 1922, the Central Executive Committee of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets ordered all church valuables to be taken within 1 month. Technically, the order allowed for exceptions of objects of historical and artistic significance, but radicals often encouraged the taking of all church valuables without exception. The Bolsheviks had several reasons for taking these church valuables, besides just famine relief. One reason was that this was their first opportunity to really attack the church head-on. During the first few months of communist rule, the Bolshevik government had issued many orders weakening the strength of the church, but most of these were about separation of church and state rather than about eradicating religion. The Bolsheviks were still very weak during these first few months, so many of the decrees that had more symbolic value than any actual effect on society. For example, in the countryside, the decree about removing religion from education was widely ignored. Most teachers were religious, and some even priests. Because the state was not strong enough to enforce the decree, religion was still regularly taught in schools. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks were more focused on fighting the White Army to stay alive than on trying to make Russia into an atheistic utopia. Now that the Civil War was winding down, the state could finally focus on domestic affairs. During the Civil War, the army had been built up, so the state was now powerful enough to at least partially enforce its decrees. The second reason was that the suffering caused by the famine allowed the state to swing public opinion in its own favor. To the public eye, it looked like the church was greedily hoarding its valuables while Russian children starved. In a letter written to a subordinate about the collection of church property, Lenin explicitly says the property must be taken in a time of famine to ensure us the sympathy of the peasants. If the property was taken any other time, the state would look like the oppressor and the church would have been seen as the victim. The Bolsheviks even managed to blame the church for the famine in an indirect way. Despite the fact that modern scholars tend to think the drought and the state's mismanagement of food distribution created the famine, the Bolsheviks blamed the famine on what the historian William Husband calls the superstitious, non-scientific approach to agriculture practiced by the peasants. If the peasants would have been practicing good socialist, scientific agricultural methods, the famine would never have happened. In addition to famine relief, the state also wanted to take church valuables to achieve its own political goals. Russia had just spent the last 6 years either fighting in World War II, World War I, or its own civil war. These wars had been expensive, and the Bolshevik government needed money if it was going to do all the things it had promised. In the same letter mentioned above, Lenin says, without these funds, any government work in general, any economic buildup in particular, and any upholding of Soviet principles is completely unthinkable. Lenin believed correctly that the church had great wealth, and if the Bolsheviks were able to take it, the property would help in the building of socialism. As was to be expected, some believers resisted the taking of valuables, but these attempts failed miserably. Lenin himself ordered that resistance should end not other than with the shooting of the very largest number of the most influential and dangerous of the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds were a religious organization that resisted the taking of church property. He believed it was important to put down the protest quickly and brutally to crush the hopes of the dissenters and ensure that the incident would be remembered for decades to come. After the famine, the church as an institution was severely weakened, but many Russians still believed in the Christian faith. To put an end to this, the Bolsheviks created the League of the Militant Godless in 1925. Even though it was not an organ of the Soviet government due to the state's official support of freedom of religion and not active atheism, it was still established by the Communist Party. Prior to this, the Bolshevik government made eradicating popular religion in Russia the goal of a variety of government institutions, such as the Cheka, the People's Commissar of Justice, and the People's Commissar of Enlightenment. However, problems with deciding who had jurisdiction over what and exchanging blame for failures made the system inefficient. The Bolshevik government would not just hope for religion to fade away. Naturally, if Russia was going to abandon religion, the institution would have to be organized by the party. The League of the Militant Godless tried a variety of propaganda techniques to change the hearts and minds of the Russian people. In the early years of the organization, propaganda focused on going after priests and the church as regularly portrayed as an old institution of the capitalist system. As time went by, the League switched its tactics to focusing on teaching a secular scientific understanding of the world. This was regularly done in the context of teaching peasants about agriculture to make the knowledge more practical. The League also sponsored lectures and demonstrations to discourage people from attending religious services. Some members even organized public openings of the tombs of saints to prove that their bodies were corruptible, contrary to popular belief at the time. In addition to these in-person propaganda efforts, the League printed a variety of anti-religious posters, pamphlets, and even a newspaper titled The Godless. Most of these efforts focused on trying to insult and highlight the negative aspects of religion rather than actually promoting atheism. In the end, the League was not very successful in achieving its goal. Despite having 5.5 million members, there is very little evidence to suggest it gained any sincere mass support. The League focused too much on insulting the church as an institution and discouraging the practice of religious holidays, and not enough on the needs of the people. When the Soviet government tried to increase its focus on secularization during the first 5-year plan, it regularly had to use force because of a lack of widespread support. Despite having a resurgence in 1937, after the 1920s, the organization slowly faded away until it formally died in 1947. Throughout the 1920s, the Bolshevik government and Communist Party used 3 main methods to remove religion from Russian society: decrees, force, and propaganda. Despite the success of the first 2 methods, the Bolsheviks were never able to make Russia into the atheistic utopia they had dreamed of. As the institution, the church was primarily treated as a semi-political organization representing a relic of the old culture, too powerful to be destroyed immediately. However, they were never able to get the peasants to completely abandon the faith, and this is why they ultimately failed to remove the Russian East Orthodox Church from Russian society. The end.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, our next paper will be Tynan Easterday, entitled "The Bund and Its Departure from the Russian Social Democrats." Tynan, take it away.
Hi there. My paper was about a socialist party in pre-revolution Russia called the Jewish Labor Bund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, commonly known as the Jewish Labor Bund or simply the Bund. And it was a major influence in the progression of revolutionary politics in Russia leading up to the 1917 revolution. Their ability to organize effectively, along with famous socialist thinkers and their membership, allowed them to fundamentally affect both Jewish political thought and the revolutionary movement in Tsarist Russia. However, ideological differences with the Russian-speaking organizations on the left eventually led to their exit from the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, or RSDWP, in 1903. The departure of the Bund from the RSDWP could be attributed to more than just ideology. Specifically, the populist nature and Jewish identity of the organization made it unique in the field of Russian social democratic parties and led to their departure. The conflict between the Bund and Lenin's crowd is helpful in understanding the dictatorial tendencies of the Bolsheviks. On the surface, the split was a result over a difference over the national question within social democracy, and more specifically, the question of Jewish nationalism. The Second Congress of the RSDWP in 1903 is most known for the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. However, the departure of the Bund is less discussed. The lack of recognition hides the true complexity of social democracy under the Tsar's rule. Besides its relationship with the Russian-speaking elements of the movement, the Bund was incredibly important in the development of the era's Jewish political thought in Eastern Europe. The Jewish Labor Bund was ultimately anti-Zionist, but not strictly assimilationist. The Bund provided important services to Jewish communities during these events and for many years after. It's important that I give a quick description of the origins of the Bund. The Jewish population in the Pale before industrialization is an example of a middleman class, with a majority of the population being involved in leaseholding, commercial enterprises, and artisanry. The focus on these economies led to a higher education, higher standard of living, and better understanding of trade compared to their non-Jewish workers. The Jewish workers in the Pale were able to use this to increase their wages as the area became industrialized. However, with the emancipation of the serfs, this advantage proved to be a liability when it came to competing with newer, cheaper labor. With better awareness of economic relationships and widespread discrimination, this community was primed for class-focused organization. The Jewish Labor Bund was the result of 3 days of meetings by 13 individuals in Vilna, Lithuania in 1897. Of these 13, only 5 were intellectuals. This focus on worker involvement stood in stark contrast to other revolutionary circles in Russia at the time, and this proved to be important later on. Of its founding members, Arkady Kremer is recognized to be the leader by nearly everyone involved. The year before the creation of the Bund, Kremer published his seminal work on agitation. In this pamphlet, he made the case for a much more active involvement of social democrats in the development of the masses towards socialism. The move towards active agitation and mass involvement, rather than small revolutionary propaganda, was one of the most important developments in revolutionary tactics in Tsarist Russia, and Kremer's On Agitation was known as the most important guide on the subject. The belief in agitation was the founding principle of the Bund. Its populism and specific Jewish nature required the Bund to propagandize in Yiddish. In order to be capable of this, they actively recruited students from the yeshiva who had a greater understanding of the culture and language than many of the original Bundists. The influx of new members and the decision to use Yiddish had an incredibly important impact on the trajectory of the Bund. The new students changed the political and cultural makeup of the Bund, giving it a less loyal making it less loyal to the Russian-speaking revolutionary movement and more sympathetic to Jewish nationalism as a whole. As well, the use of Yiddish permanently made them much more independent of the all-Russian movement, as they no longer worked towards recruiting for the Russian-speaking organizations, and instead developed their own systems of activity. At the first RSDWP Congress in 1898, the Bund was the only organization present that did not use Russian for its propaganda, and they had by far the most worker activists in their ranks, along with the only worker delegate present at that Congress. It is here that the Bund was granted an autonomous status within the party to decide questions pertaining to the Jewish population. There was not a real debate over this, as they were the only party that represented a specific nationality. However, Lenin and his colleagues were not present at the first Congress due to their exile. This lack of Lenin's presence, along with the widespread arrest of those attending, ultimately delegitimized the decision for an autonomous status for the Bund. Regardless, the decisions made at the first Congress of the RSDWP ended up planting the seeds for the open conflict that would occur later between the Bund and Russian-speaking organizations. In 1901, the Bund began to expand its recruitment of Jewish dissidents outside of the Pale. This would put them in competition with other organizations over recruitment. This angered Lenin and Iskra, which was his pamphlet, because they believed that the solution to social democracy's problems lie in the creation of a centralized party structure. This argument began the conflict between the two groups. The cooling of relations between these groups began despite the historical ties in terms of leadership, specifically Julius Martov, who, interestingly enough, would lead the Menshevik coalition after the other split in 1903. Iskra criticized the independence of the Bund, The Israelites never directly commented on the existence of a Jewish nation, but instead focused on the Boon's autonomous status as illegal and charged that it would separate the Jewish proletariat from the all-Russian proletariat. This conflict was partly about the national issue, but it was much more about party structure, with Lenin and his cohorts wishing for a strong centralized party. Dr. Henry Tobias, who has done quite a bit of research on the Bund, says that this was an early sign of Lenin's inclination for control and hegemony. Seeking to solve this issue of disunity within social democracy in the Russian Empire, the Bund and friendly groups tried to organize a second Congress in 1902. Iskra and Lenin were invited but did not attend. Instead, they said this meeting should be changed to a preparatory committee for the second Congress. This wish was granted because they could not get enough delegates to attend the meeting. Even worse, all members of the committee were arrested but one, drastically weakening the legitimacy of the decisions made there. At Lenin's suggestion, a new preparatory committee was convened. Lenin showed his political prowess by working to create draft legislation and forming the committee to be friendly to him before it was even made public. At this second organization committee, the Bund was too hurt by mass arrest to actually send a delegation. In fact, only 3 of the 7 members of the original committee were present. Ultimately, this new meeting also failed to meet attendance requirements. However, Lenin and Iskra ignored this, which especially hurt relationships between them and the Bund. Lenin said that an independent Jewish party would be as useless as it divided workers by territory, and that it was time for the RSDWP to unify, which meant the end of the right of organizations to act independently. The Bund clarified that it was an organization defined by a common Jewish culture within Russia, rather than one defined by the territory of the Pale, and that national groups would be better equipped at energizing the respective proletariat. As they headed into this conference, the Bund maintained their demands for recognition that they were the sole representative of Jewish workers and that they should not be constrained by territorial limits on their recruitment and activity. They knew that these were not likely to be met, and when Congress came around, the Bund's departure was written on the wall. After rejection of federative status that they asked for, the Bund walked out of session and left the RSDWP. They believed that their integrity resided in the existence as a national organization, and they refused to compromise. Their determination came from the conditions in which the Bund developed. Since they agitated only with Jewish workers, they used Yiddish, and in order to do so, they incorporated a younger, more nationalistic membership. This and the unique conditions that faced Jewish workers allowed for a brand of grassroots, nationalistic social democracy not found in other Russian parties. Lenin accused the Bund of fostering Jewish nationalism, despite a parallel rise in Zionist movements at the time. This attack also indicated Lenin's doubts about the existence of a Jewish nation within Russia. The combination of Jewish nationalism and the Jewish proletariat's economic realities are the seeds of what made the Bund so different from its revolutionary contemporaries. However, the historical relevance of the Bund extends way beyond its differences with other Russian socialist groups. Through the beginning of the 20th century, the Bund was a major player within the politics of non-Soviet Eastern Europe. Because of its consistent opposition to Zionism, the Bund and its politics can never be described as representing the majority of Jewish people in Eastern Europe. Regardless, its importance in Jewish political thought and theory should not be understated. Also, the Bund was instrumental in the creation of secular Yiddish schools and the promotion of Jewish culture. They organized defense groups to protect against anti-Semitic attacks and were a major player in the resistance to German occupation. The Jewish Labor Bund of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia was a major player in the early politics of revolutionary circles in Tsarist Russia. They assumed the role as the main opposition to Iskra and Lenin on the issue of party structure, specifically in respect to nationalities. Beyond the cause of this conflict, it is worthy of study because it helps illustrate the tendencies of the winners of the Russian Revolution. The Bund has been underrepresented in discussions of this time, due in no small part to Soviet revisionism. This party had a very interesting role to play in this era of Eastern European and Russian politics, and hopefully this will be eventually reflected in discussions of the time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tynan. We are going to close out our day with Rachel Leap, who is presenting on Soviet sports culture.
All of you still awake, right? No. Russian athletes today are known as some of the most ruthless and devoted players in all of sport. Their success today is closely linked with the legendary accomplishments of Soviet international teams from the 60s until the late 80s. The Soviet Union crafted a premier sports culture that encouraged athletes to pursue winning above all other considerations. This culture manifested both the extraordinary success of some athletes, but also to the devastation both mentally and physically for those who were pushed beyond their limits. The inhumane and immoral practices surrounding Soviet sports and the political power sports exemplified are still being mirrored in Russia today, despite the negative consequences Soviet sports had on the sportsmanship of global competition and the health of athletes. The popularity of physical fitness was no mistake. After World War I, the regime actively cultivated citizens for sport. Beginning in grade school, children would be tested on their capabilities and given awards for their success. Students who were promising enough were sent away to one of the USSR's sports training schools in an effort to mold them into the perfect athlete. Common people also lauded sports because they were broadcast on TV, and friendly competition offered an active entertainment outlet that was accepted in the USSR. Creating an incredible sports infrastructure with state-of-the-art equipment, stadiums, and activities for all to participate in was the first step in solidifying the dangerous rhetoric surrounding sports in the USSR. The association of exercise and sport with accomplishment and superiority was widely propagandized in the Soviet Union because it was a great tool for the regime. The vast empire the USSR engulfed could not be united by religion, race, or culture, so sports had the unique capability to bring the ethnicities within the state together to celebrate the regime's superiority on an international level, as well as to admire the success of athletes from their own ethnicity or region. Early on, athletics had also taken on military characteristics, with sports prowess being associated with preparedness for battle. After 1950, sports provided a platform where the USSR could legitimize themselves as a power to be taken seriously. As the Soviets continued winning at international competitions, pride they felt in their country increased. Pressure was applied for athletes to win for the glory of their nation. Athletes were no longer individuals competing for personal accomplishment, but had become the embodiment of communism's success. Associating sport with the power of the government and putting pressure on athletes to capture the glory of the USSR was the foundation upon which dangerous and tragic practices were endorsed by the Soviet Union. So now I'm going to try to get into some of the examples of the dangerous things that happened or the immoral kind of things that happened in the USSR. The effects the pressure had on athletes in competition was devastating. One particularly remarkable example of this cruelty is the experience of gymnast Elena Mukina. Her parents died young and she lived with her grandmother, but she began to take an interest in gymnastics. At first she wasn't noticed, but after Nadia Comaneci's outstanding victories for Romania in the 1976 Olympics, the USSR was desperate to regain its dominance in gymnastics. She grabbed the attention of a coach who began training her to become the gymnast who would overthrow Comaneci. The training had paid off in 1977 when she won gold in the European Championships, followed by 1978, where she won both team and individual gold medals at the World Championships. During this time period, she was forced into excessive training by her coach and put under pressure to continue or be a disappointment. The pressure only increased after her winnings, though, and as the 1980 Olympics hosted in Moscow were approaching, amidst her intense practice sessions, she broke her leg in 1979, and the Soviet gymnastics team was again defeated. In spite of her injury, doctors wanted to remove her cast early, even though Mukina protested that her leg hadn't fully healed. After her cast was removed, she was forced to diet because of the weight she had gained during injury and began training immediately for the 1980 Olympics. Her new training included a technique never performed by a woman, the Thomas Salto flip. This flip is really dangerous because it involves doing like a front flip and then like landing. Her new training, while practicing this move, she snapped her neck and became a quadriplegic at the age of 20. In an interview after the accident, she said she knew the move was too dangerous and she was not healthy enough to practice. The regime tried to cover up the extent of her injury, but news got out after her partial recovery, which was like 5 years later, so yeah. But Mooke and his experiences exemplify how the motivations of athletes and their coaches could overstep what a person was ethically capable of doing. The 1972 Olympic basketball final is an example of a different type of Soviet sports corruption. The United States had long dominated the field of basketball, and no other team had ever won gold in this area. This time, though, the Soviets were up 49-48 with only 10 seconds left on the clock. The ball was stolen by the Americans one more time, and player Doug Collins made his way up to the basket. He was pulled down, hitting his head against the rim and floor very hard. Collins recovered and made 2 free throws, putting the Americans back in the lead. The Soviets had tried to call a timeout in between free throws, but were only granted one once the clock resumed at 3 seconds left. The time it took to call a timeout left only 1 second left on the clock. But an administrator insisted that 3 seconds be put back on the scoreboard. The players took the court and the clock ran out, but 3 seconds were added to the clock again because spectators were apparently still on the court. The referees and judges were heavy in Soviet representation, so these clock additions are often accused of being phony. In the remaining 3 seconds of the game, Soviet player Alexander Belov managed to shoot a layup, making the Soviets the first non-American winners at Olympics men's basketball. The Americans felt so cheated by these clock-changing schemes that they refused to accept their silver medals. This game represents the seedy techniques Soviets employed in order to win international events. The rhetoric surrounding athletics in the Soviet Union naturally spread to Eastern Bloc states. East Germany in particular executed a sports program that featured many methods similar to the Soviets, becoming infamous in their own right for their extensive doping program. These doping programs were taken very seriously, being carried out by the Stasi, the East German police, secret police. The doping program was extremely successful and produced a lot of gold medals and world records for East Germany. The most controversial of these world records are held in women's track and field. Many modern critics argue that these records will never be broken and should be expunged from the record considering the history of drug use in East Germany. Many of the East German medalists and record holders have ceded their winnings. However, some are not convinced that they had done anything wrong. Marita Cooke set the world record for the 400-meter dash in 1985 with a time of 47.6 seconds. Like a fast time for this now would be like 50 seconds or 51 seconds. Since then, there hasn't been a competitor who has gotten close to her record, and some documents were released identifying her as taking part in a doping program. Other former athletes have taken action in recent years, suing to get compensation for the permanent damage done to their bodies. At the 1980 Olympics, Rika Reinsick, a 15-year-old East German swimmer, came out of nowhere and set 4 world records. As a result of extensive steroid use, she had several ovarian cysts and miscarriages. Her coaches told her that she either take steroids or all of her training would be pointless. Clearly, a precedent had been set in the Soviet realm that using unsafe drugs to set skewed record was an acceptable way to achieve victories. Soviet sports abused power, rules, and their own athletes. Pressure from the regime made athletics a representation of communism's power both literally and metaphorically. Even though these injustices are obvious, similarities between the Soviet system and modern Russia continue to arise. Russian doping and cheating are covered widely in the media, but the actual government continues to place athletic ability on a pedestal in the manner of the Soviets. Alexander Karelin, a former Greco-Roman wrestler who's considered by many to be the best of all time, was chosen by Vladimir Putin to be a member of his party in 1999 and continues to be an active member of his political squad without any prior experience. Former medal-winning pairs figure skater Irina Rodnina is also a member of Putin's government party. In 2013, she sparked controversy after tweeting an image of President Obama and his wife looking at something with a banana photoshopped in front of them. The racist implications of this picture were clear. However, Rodnina claimed that she did not tweet the picture because of racism, and attacks on her character were attacks against freedom of speech. These two athletes had no prior experience in governance, but because of their status and the celebrity they experienced as Soviet stars, they have been chosen to represent the Russian people, however poorly. The modern Russian government is continuing to exploit the dangerous culture of sport developed by the Soviet Union in the name of political unity, ignoring the evidence that this system breeds injury and ill reputation.
All right, thank you so much to all three of our panelists. We do have some time for questions now, so feel free, anyone who's got any questions for our panelists.
Great papers, all fantastic. My question is for Rachel. Have Soviet athletes, well, now Russian athletes, have they redeemed themselves since the 70s and 80s, or are they still frowned upon and made fun of?
I think Russian athletes today are still relatively frowned upon, especially with like the many doping scandals that have come along. I would just say that like the doping that they're doing today is kind of like is very reflective of the past, in the sense that like the reason they're doing it is clearly to boost the reputation of Russia as a world power. So yeah, I would say it's definitely still frowned upon.
The first two papers dealt with the issue of conflict in the Russian Revolution, either in the issue of politics or religion. And I just wondered if the first two speakers could comment on that.
I can go first. Well, yeah, part of the thing that really interested me in my paper is there's like a narrative that Lenin was kind of this, you know, all-powerful, charismatic figure who kind of got his way. And in my research, I found that socialism and left-think and Marxist beliefs in Russia weren't, they're much more diverse than I expected. And the conflict within them surprised me. And also to see my paper, the majority of the politics took in 1902 and 1903, and to see the same issues came up with Lenin's efforts to consolidate power during the revolution happened so early and give such an indication of what was to come was really interesting to me.
I'm sorry, so is your question just like how was the conflict between like religion and...
Well, yours, you dealt with the whole issue of religion and how religion played into it and how big a factor that was and how much of a challenge it was for the revolutionary state. So I was just curious, it's sort of interesting because in the case of Mexico around the same time, there's a level of anti-clericalism in the revolution, and into the new constitution, there's anti-clerical measures, and then there's a huge revolt that lasts about 3 or 4 years in the 1920s, where the state finally suppresses the church. So I saw some parallels there, and I was curious about your case.
Yeah, I guess there is, and like a lot of times when the Soviet Union's like going after like Christianity broadly, it's going after the priests in particular, right? And they also do this weird thing of during the Soviet Union, they had to use, because the Soviet government was so new, they had to use experts from the Tsarist regime. So they would use like retired like priests who like didn't want to be priests anymore, and they would use them, like they would hire them in the League of the Militant Godless to produce anti-religious propaganda, as like sort of this example of like, see, these people switched to atheism, you should too, which is weird, but yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Bauer.
I've got questions for Kevin and for Tynan, so I'll ask Kevin first. What your opinion is about sort of as the Soviet Union developed and kept going into the Cold War, whether their opposition to organized religion was something that helped the USSR stay together and consolidated and gave identity, or whether it was something that ended up being harmful, both from, as you mentioned, peasants who wanted to, remain loyal to their religion. But I'm thinking especially from the outside, I know all the Western countries used communist opposition to organized religion as one of the main things to rally their populations against them. And, you know, when you get into the Cold War and you have this big ideological divide, that's one of the things that makes communism seem so scary to the West. You know, forget the equality, forget all the rest, but they don't like God. So yeah, if you think it helped or harmed, so think on that. And then Tynan, I was kind of trying to wrap my head around identity politics in the way you describe this. And, you know, for this Jewish organization in particular that, as you mentioned, sort of views itself as the Jewish nation. And this is always something interesting in European history, the rise of nationalism, and, you know, yet you have the Jews as a nation apart. So that's why it was interesting that you mentioned they were anti-Zionist. And I guess I'm curious what your Bund sort of envisioned happening in a post-Tsarist Russia, what the Bund thought they were going towards, what it was going to look like if they achieved, you know, a revolution or something their way, and if it was something that included Jews as part of a new nation, or if the Jewish group wanted to remain apart, and where they thought, I know this is a lot of questions in one, but you know, why they were anti-Zionist. If they saw themselves as a Jewish nation apart, did they see themselves in relation with French Zionists and other?
Okay. I guess I would answer the question by saying their very aggressive policies were like destructive in the way that they made the government look like it was going after the people. Like these, like the peasants a lot of times who were like the actual like very religious people were like not really doing anything like terribly like aggressive against the state. It looked like the state was just going after them. I think where they did succeed was in just like fading like religion out. For example, just like making the school secularized. So like these like long-term policies were effective in like just like making it so like 30 years later like the kids didn't like know about religion or whatever, and then like after that like I think those kind of policies were a lot more effective than the aggressive ones.
And what about the question of whether, you know, the opposition, did they conceive of their opposition to God as something that was going to bring the whole rest of the world
to them?
And did that end up harming the Soviet Union in the long run? Like did they create more enemies?
Oh yeah, I guess I didn't look into that because I didn't. Yeah, but that's probably a good point. Yeah, like I didn't know how they understood like how their atheism reflected like influenced other people's behavior towards them. Yeah, I guess I don't know.
Next research paper.
Yeah.
On your questions on the Jewish identity, one of the interesting things I found when researching the Bund was there was a lot of diversity when it came to their thinking on the Jewish question, whether the Jewish peoples were a stranger in Russia, or whether they were an integral part of the proletariat and just like some section, or whether, you know, and there was Zionist within the movement. However, it was considered kind of the anti-Zionist political thought at the time, like the party for people who felt like that. And it's like kind of further complicated about the fluidity of membership. As the revolution went on and as the Soviets came to power, a lot of Bundists ended up joining the Communist Party and kind of distancing themselves for a variety of reasons, some of them safety, from their previous thoughts. I do think, like, as in terms of what they kind of envisioned, they had one of the premier thinkers in it was Vladimir Medem, and he is really important in writing within the Jewish community on the Jewish nation, but also within Russia. And him and the Bundists had this policy of neutralism, which was their at the beginning, which did not advocate really for assimilationism for or against, but did recognize the existence of a Jewish nation and the oppression of that nation. And going forward, the Bund called for the Social Democrats Party to be not a centralized power structure as Lenin envisioned, but a federation of national proletariat interests to organize around each other. And so they viewed themselves the same way a group of, Kazakhstani, Workers' Party might have worked. But that was very incompatible with Lenin's ideas.
I think we do have time for one more question with Dr. Schuster.
Hi, thank you very much for your papers. My question's for Rachel. Within the United States, sports has been an area for gender relations to be hashed out, especially since the 60s, the women's movement, Title IX, et cetera. It's influenced things like Ladies Professional Golf Association, tennis, et cetera. Have you found anything similar in the Soviet Union, where sports had become this kind of a venue for people to start hammering out issues of sexual equality?
A little bit. I think the Soviet Union, especially Eastern Germany's focus on women in track and field, they were really trying to create these super athletes that were women in, obviously partially for their own acclaim, but it seemed like they were really trying to make women's sports, women in every sport, because I think in the Olympics at that time, there wasn't a female equivalent for every sport. So I think the Soviets definitely wanted to put women in every international realm. Maybe not so much for the sake of women, more for their own, being able to accomplish something in those before any other country. But I wish I'd researched it a little more, but yeah, it was important to them to some extent.
Okay, I'm guessing Dr. Bauer might have a closing remark or two, but let's give our panelists one more round of applause.